A lioness rescues a dying baby in the desert. The sun hung low over the endless expanse of golden dunes, casting long, jagged shadows across the barren desert. The heat of the day lingered, radiating off the sands in shimmering waves, while the wind howled relentlessly, carrying with it a whisper of desperation. This was a land of survival, where life and death danced precariously close, and mercy was as scarce as water. Amid the vast emptiness, a small wooden cart sat abandoned, its wheels half buried in the sand. The remains of torn fabric fluttered weakly in the breeze, clinging to the frame as though refusing to surrender to the elements. Scattered nearby were remnants of what must have been a desperate journey. A cracked clay water jug, a tattered satchel, and a trail of footprints, already fading under the shifting sands. Next to the cart lay a young woman, her body sprawled motionless, half buried in the swirling dust. Her skin, dry and sunburned, bore the unmistakable marks of exhaustion and dehydration. Her chapped lips parted slightly, as if she'd been whispering prayers to the desert before succumbing to its merciless grasp. A fragile hope rested in her final act, shielding a small, makeshift cradle with her frail arm. From within the cradle came the faintest sound, a baby's cry, soft and broken, barely audible over the roaring wind. The infant, swaddled in a thin piece of cloth, squirmed weakly, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Its cheeks, once rosy, were pale and streaked with sand. A pair of wide, tear-filled eyes blinked against the glaring sunlight, searching for the mother who could no longer answer its cries. The desert, vast and indifferent, seemed ready to claim yet another life. Overhead, vultures circled ominously, their dark silhouettes casting fleeting shadows across the sands. In the distance, the mournful howls of jackals pierced the air, carried far by the relentless gusts. But amidst the chaos and despair, something stirred. Far off on a distant dune, a pair of golden eyes glinted in the fading light. A lioness emerged from the shadows, her sleek, muscular frame moving effortlessly over the sands. Her tawny coat blended seamlessly with the landscape, save for a faint scar running across her right flank, a mark of battles fought and won in the harsh wilderness. The lioness paused, her ears swiveling to catch the faint sound of the infant's cries. Her sharp nose twitched, catching an unfamiliar scent, human, mixed with sweat, fear, and a trace of milk. She tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the distant cart as though she could sense the fragile life clinging to existence within. Her instincts urged her to turn away, to return to the hunt that would feed her pride waiting miles away. But something in the pitiful sound tugged at her primal senses, sparking a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, something unexplainable. Slowly, the lioness began her descent from the dune, each step careful and deliberate. The soft padding of her paws disturbed the sand, leaving faint imprints in her wake. She moved closer, her silhouette growing larger as she approached the cradle. The baby's cries faltered as the lioness drew near, her golden eyes locked onto the tiny figure swaddled in cloth, her head lowering to sniff the unfamiliar creature. The infant stared back, its wide eyes unblinking, as if sensing the presence of something extraordinary. The lioness paused, her massive form towering over the fragile cradle. The audience held their breath. Was she a predator, drawn by weakness, or a savior compelled by something far beyond instinct? The wind howled louder, the vultures circled closer, and the desert seemed to hold its breath as the lioness made her move. And then, in a moment that defied the very nature of the wild, she gently curled her powerful jaws around the edge of the cradle, lifting it with a surprising tenderness. Turning away from the broken cart and the lifeless woman, the lioness carried the baby into the desert, her massive paws leaving a trail in the shifting sands. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, as the lioness disappeared into the growing darkness, taking with her the fragile hope of a miracle. The desert night descended quickly, the fiery heat of the day replaced by an unrelenting chill. The shifting sands sparkled faintly under the pale glow of a crescent moon, and a biting wind whipped through the dunes, erasing footprints and stirring whispers among the arid plains. Beneath this vast and indifferent sky, life hung by a thread. The lioness moved with purpose, her sleek, golden form cutting through the dunes like a shadow. Her powerful paws pressed silently into the sand, carrying with them a cradle, a fragile lifeline cradled in her jaws. The infant's faint cries pierced the stillness, soft yet insistent, a plea to the unyielding desert for mercy. Each step the lioness took was deliberate, her senses attuned to the dangers of the night. Jackals' howls echoed in the distance, their eerie calls a reminder that the desert was alive with predators. The lioness paused at the crest of a ridge, her ears twitching, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain for movement. Beneath her, the cradle swayed gently with every breath of the wind, its occupant wrapped in cloth too thin to guard against the cold. The lioness lowered her burden carefully onto the sand and sat beside it, her massive frame shielding the baby from the icy gusts. For a moment, she stared at the infant, her golden eyes reflecting the pale light of the stars. Her instincts told her to move on, to leave this delicate creature to its fate. But something held her there, a pull that defied explanation. She leaned down, her hot breath warming the baby's face, and let out a low, guttural rumble, a sound that was neither threatening nor soothing but somewhere in between. The baby stirred, its tiny hand flailing in the air as though reaching for something unseen. The lioness tilted her head, watching with an expression that seemed almost curious. A village at the edge of the desert. Miles away, the village of Al-Namib lay silent under the moonlight. The cluster of mud-brick homes stood like sentinels against the encroaching sands, their walls worn smooth by years of relentless winds. Inside one of the houses, Omar stirred restlessly in his bed. The young shepherd was used to the rhythms of the desert, its harsh days and unforgiving nights, but tonight felt different. Something in the wind carried a strange energy, an unease that made his skin prickle. He rose quietly, careful not to wake his younger siblings who lay sprawled on the floor beside him, and stepped outside. The cold air bit at his skin as he gazed out at the vast expanse of dunes. In the distance, he saw the faint flicker of movement, something small and fleeting, swallowed quickly by the darkness. Omar frowned. Predators rarely ventured this close to the village, but the desert was unpredictable, and caution was a way of life here. Grabbing his staff, a sturdy piece of wood worn smooth by years of use, he set out toward the grazing grounds where his goats were penned. The desert comes alive. Back in the heart of the dunes, the lioness stood abruptly, her ears flattening against her skull. A faint rustling had reached her ears, carried on the wind, a sound too deliberate to be mere desert noise. She turned her head sharply toward the source, her golden eyes narrowing. From behind a nearby dune, a jackal slinked into view, its lean body silhouetted against the moonlight. It moved cautiously, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of human milk and vulnerable flesh. The jackal's glowing eyes locked onto the cradle, and it began to advance. The lioness let out a low growl, a sound that rumbled deep in her chest and reverberated through the sands. The jackal froze, its thin frame quivering as it assessed the larger predator. For a moment, the two creatures stared at each other, their wild instincts clashing in a silent battle. Then, with a sharp yelp, the jackal turned tail and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the lioness victorious. She relaxed slightly but did not sit. The desert was full of dangers, and she knew more would come. Her ears swiveled constantly, catching every whisper of the wind, while her eyes remained fixed on the cradle. The shepherd's discovery. As Omar approached the grazing grounds, his sharp eyes caught something unusual. A series of tracks crisscrossed the sand near the fence. A jumble of paw prints, some small and erratic, others larger and more deliberate. His heart quickened as he knelt to examine them. "These aren't from the goats," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. His fingers traced the impressions in the sand, noting their size and depth. The larger prints were unmistakable, those of a lion. Fear and curiosity battled within him as he stood and scanned the horizon. The tracks led away from the village, deeper into the desert, where danger lurked in every shadow. He hesitated, clutching his staff tightly. Lions rarely ventured into human territory unless driven by desperation. If one was nearby, it posed a threat not just to his flock but to his family as well. Omar took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. He couldn't ignore this. Setting off in the direction of the tracks, he moved cautiously, his eyes and ears alert for any sign of movement. The lioness and the baby. As dawn began to break, the desert's golden sands were bathed in a soft, warm light. The lioness stopped near an outcrop of rocks, her powerful legs trembling slightly from the long night's journey. She placed the cradle gently on the ground and crouched beside it, her tail flicking back and forth as she surveyed her surroundings. The infant's cries were growing weaker, its tiny body shivering from the cold. The lioness lowered her head to the cradle, her nose brushing against the baby's cheek. A low, rumbling sound escaped her throat, almost like a purr. She nudged the edge of the cradle with her nose, tilting it slightly so the infant's head rested at a better angle. Nearby, a trickle of water glistened in the morning light, pooling in a shallow crevice among the rocks. The lioness rose and padded over to it, lapping up the cool liquid before returning to the cradle. She dipped her paw into the water, shaking off the excess, and nudged the baby again. Tiny droplets trickled down the infant's face, and its lips parted instinctively, catching the moisture. The lioness repeated the process, her movements careful and deliberate, until the baby's cries grew stronger. A meeting in the sands. It was this sound, the renewed strength in the baby's cries, that reached Omar as he crested a nearby dune. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes locked onto the scene below. There, in the golden light of dawn, stood a lioness. Her massive frame was both majestic and terrifying, her golden coat gleaming like fire. Beside her lay a wooden cradle, and within it, a human baby. For a moment, Omar couldn't move. The sheer impossibility of what he was seeing rooted him to the spot. A predator, the queen of the desert, standing guard over a fragile life that should have been prey? His instincts screamed at him to run, but something deeper, something primal, kept him rooted in place. He tightened his grip on his staff, swallowing hard. If the lioness turned on him, he would have little chance of escape. The lioness's ears twitched, and she turned her head toward him. Their eyes met, and Omar felt a chill run down his spine. The lioness's gaze was intense, intelligent, and unyielding. She let out a low growl, a warning that vibrated through the air like a distant drumbeat. Omar raised his hands slowly, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Peace, great queen. I mean no harm." The lioness didn't move, her posture tense but not aggressive. Omar took a cautious step forward, then another, his heart pounding in his chest. The baby let out a weak cry, breaking the tension. The lioness turned her attention back to the cradle, lowering her head to nuzzle the infant. Omar froze again, watching in awe as the massive predator displayed a tenderness that defied her nature. Summoning his courage, Omar reached into his satchel and pulled out a small leather pouch of water. He poured a few drops into his palm and held it out cautiously. "The child needs water," he said softly. The lioness didn't react at first, her golden eyes fixed on his every movement. Slowly, she stepped aside, her muscles coiled like springs, ready to strike if he made a wrong move. Omar approached the cradle and knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he dribbled water onto the baby's parched lips. The infant drank greedily, its tiny hands flailing weakly in the air. Omar let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. He glanced up at the lioness, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "You've done well," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've saved this child." The lioness blinked slowly, her tail flicking once. Then, as if her task was complete, she turned and began to walk away. Omar watched her go, her powerful frame disappearing into the dunes. He stood there for a long moment, cradling the baby in his arms, before turning toward the village, his mind racing with the enormity of what had just happened. As Omar made his way back toward the village, cradling the baby in his arms, His mind was a whirlpool of confusion and disbelief. He had spent most of his life in the desert, accustomed to its dangers and rhythms. Lions were not a common sight, and certainly not in the company of human infants. Yet, there he was, holding the child that a lioness had gently guarded, fed, and protected through the desert's unforgiving night. The journey back was slow, each step heavy with the weight of the discovery he had made. His thoughts flickered between the fear he felt upon seeing the lioness and the strange tenderness she had shown the baby. She had not treated the child as prey, nor had she acted with the predatory aggression that he had always been taught to fear in such creatures. The lioness had protected the baby, an act that contradicted everything Omar knew about the laws of nature. The village lay just ahead, nestled against the rugged cliffs at the edge of the desert, its mud-brick houses scattered beneath the rocky outcrop like the scattered bones of some ancient animal. As he neared the familiar site of the village gates, the memory of the lioness's golden eyes lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the thought that there was something almost human about the way she had looked at him. It wasn't the gaze of a predator. It was something more, something wise, as if she understood the weight of what had passed between them. When Omar entered the village, the first person he saw was his younger sister, Layla, who was tending to the family's goats. She froze upon seeing him, her face a mixture of relief and confusion. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the ground, and the wind carried a chill that seeped into the bones. Omar's clothes were torn, and dust covered his face. But what made Layla's breath catch wasn't the state of his appearance. It was the tiny bundle he was carrying. "Omar, what is that?" Layla's voice trembled, and she rushed forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A baby?" Omar said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I found it in the desert. And I found something else. Something I can't explain." Layla took a step back, her eyes flicking nervously toward the desert. "What do you mean? How? Why is it with you? What happened?" Omar hesitated, his throat tight. He knew the story would sound impossible, absurd, even, but it was the truth. "I was walking in the desert," he began slowly, finding it difficult to speak the words aloud. "And I found this lioness. She was protecting the baby. She had been carrying it in her mouth, gently, like it was her own cub." Layla stared at him, her expression unreadable. She seemed to be trying to make sense of the words, her mind struggling to form a coherent picture of what her brother had just described. "A lioness?" Layla asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You're saying a lioness carried the baby? And you're sure it wasn't, dangerous?" Omar nodded slowly, still in awe of the lioness's unexpected role in the baby's survival. "She wasn't dangerous," he said firmly. "Not to the baby. To me, yes, but she didn't harm it. She protected it, fed it, and even kept it safe through the night." He swallowed hard, still struggling to believe it himself. "I don't know how or why, but she did." For a long moment, Layla was silent, her eyes scanning her brother's face as if searching for some sign of the truth. Then, with a shuddering breath, she stepped forward and took the baby gently from his arms, her hands trembling as she cradled the tiny, fragile form against her chest. "But where is the lioness now? Why did she leave?" "She just walked away," Omar said. "She didn't look back. It was like her task was complete. She didn't want anything from us." A shiver ran down Layla's spine as she gazed down at the baby. She couldn't understand it, not fully. She had heard stories, old tales passed down by their ancestors, of animals that formed bonds with humans, of creatures that acted as guardians or protectors. But none of it seemed real, not until now. The unlikely savior's departure. As Layla turned to lead the baby into their family's small home, the village started to stir with activity. Omar's story spread quickly, carried by the same winds that had swept across the desert, stirring the curiosity of the villagers. Soon, a small crowd began to form near Omar's family's home, eager to learn of the discovery that had come from the wilderness. The elders, who had lived through countless seasons of hardship, had seen many things in their lives. But none of them could recall a story quite like this. Lions were a threat, dangerous territorial creatures. But the story Omar told wasn't one of destruction. It was one of an unexpected act of mercy. As the villagers gathered around, their eyes fixed on the baby in Layla's arms, a murmur of awe passed through the crowd. Some whispered of ancient legends, the stories of guardian animals, of creatures from the wild that had protected humans in times of need. Others, more practical and cautious, scoffed at the idea, calling it nothing more than a fable. But even they couldn't deny the truth in Omar's eyes, the conviction with which he spoke. "The lioness didn't attack me," Omar repeated. "She watched over the baby, and when I approached, she let me help. She knew something I didn't. She knew the baby needed to survive." The elder, a grizzled man named Rafik, stepped forward from the crowd. His eyes narrowed in thought. "And you are certain this was a lioness? Not a cougar or some other beast?" "I saw her clearly," Omar replied. "She was no smaller than any lion I've ever seen, but she did not act like one. She wasn't hunting. She wasn't guarding a kill. She just watched." The elder grunted, stroking his beard. "And now the question is, what do we do with the child?" Omar shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the baby in Layla's arms. "I don't know. I couldn't leave it there, alone in the desert. I brought it here because I felt like that's where it belonged." Rafik's gaze softened, a rare occurrence in his weathered face. "It seems the desert has sent us a gift, or a message." He turned to the others, his voice lowering. "We must be careful, for there are those who would see this child as something else entirely. A miracle, yes, but also a danger to our traditions, the desert's echoes." As days passed, the village found itself grappling with the implications of what had occurred. The lioness's actions were discussed in hushed tones, passed from elder to elder, until the story became part of the village's lore. Children asked for details about the great lioness, eager to hear the story, while the elders pondered its meaning. But life continued. The baby, now named Maya by Layla, grew stronger each day under the care of her newfound family. She was like any child, except for one thing. Her presence seemed to echo the lessons of the desert. There was an unspoken wisdom in her, as though she carried with her a connection to the wild. Omar, though still unsure of the lioness's actions, began to notice subtle changes in the way the villagers regarded the child. Maya was no longer just a survivor. She had become a symbol, a link between the human world and the vast, untamed desert that surrounded them. But even as the village began to embrace the child, the memory of the lioness lingered in the shadows, her gaze never far from their thoughts. Omar would often find himself staring out toward the dunes, wondering if she would ever return. Would she seek the child again? Would Maya, as she grew older, come to understand her protector's mysterious gift? For now, though the lioness had faded into the distance, her form vanishing among the dunes, leaving only the echo of her presence. And Maya, the unlikely child of the desert, carried with her the power of a bond that transcended the laws of nature. The village would never forget the day a lioness had saved a child, and in return, the child had begun a journey that would change everything. The days that followed the lioness's incredible act of mercy were not without their difficulties. Though the villagers had accepted the baby into their lives, the presence of the child, Maya, brought about a series of challenges, both emotional and physical, that no one had anticipated. Life in the desert was never easy, but it was about to become even harder for those who had chosen to care for the miracle child. Omar and Layla, the two siblings who had found Maya in the desert, found their lives altered irrevocably. The village, though small and tight-knit, was no stranger to hardship. The desert was unforgiving, and the land provided only as much as it chose. It was a place where survival was a daily battle, and every inch of water, every source of food, was hard-earned. But now, with the addition of Maya, the pressure on the family and the village as a whole grew exponentially. The desert's trials. Omar and Layla worked tirelessly to keep Maya alive and healthy. They fed her with what little they had, but as the days passed, They realized that there was far more to survival than just feeding and sheltering a child. The desert was not kind to those who did not belong to it, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that the harsh environment would not allow them to simply continue with life as usual. The scorching heat of the day was relentless. Even before the sun reached its peak, the temperature could soar to unbearable heights. They would carry Maya inside the small home during the hottest hours, where the walls, though thick, could not protect them completely from the sweltering heat. The days were filled with constant labor, filling water jars, tending to the goats, gathering firewood. They had learned to do everything together, but every moment felt like a race against time, knowing that even the smallest mistake could lead to disaster. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Omar stood at the edge of the village looking out toward the dunes. His thoughts were heavy, the weight of the child's survival pressing down on him. He had promised the lioness that he would care for Maya, and though he had done everything in his power to keep that promise, it felt as though the desert itself was testing him. "Maya needs more," he muttered to himself. "More than we can give her." Layla approached, her face tired, her clothes dusted with sand. "She needs water, but the wells are running low, Omar," she said, her voice strained. "We have to keep using it sparingly." "I know," he replied quietly. "But what if the rains don't come? What if we can't keep her alive?" Layla hesitated before speaking. "I saw something in her today, something strange. When she was playing near the goats, she seemed to know where the sick one was. She went straight to it, as if she could sense it." Omar turned to look at his sister, his expression one of disbelief. "You think she's like the lioness? Connected to the desert in some way?" "I don't know," Layla said, her voice quiet. "But there's something different about her, something I can't explain." The mention of the lioness brought a wave of emotion that swept through Omar. He remembered the golden eyes of the lioness, her fierce yet tender protection of Maya. He remembered how the lioness had looked at him, almost as if she had known that her task was not just to save a baby, but to entrust that baby to him. It was as though Maya were a symbol of something greater, something sacred, and the responsibility of caring for her felt overwhelming. Maya's strength and struggles. As the days went on, Maya began to grow stronger. She laughed, she cried, and her eyes sparkled with a kind of innocence that filled their hearts with joy. Yet, even in her infancy, there were signs of the desert's hold over her, signs that no one could ignore. The way she would reach for the goats or the wild desert birds, her small hands seeming to understand the creatures around her in ways that defied her age. There was a connection to the wild that ran deeper than anyone could understand. One morning, as Maya lay in Layla's arms, a strange change began to take place. Layla had been watching Maya closely, noticing that she seemed more aware of her surroundings than other babies her age. But this morning, Maya's behavior shifted in a way that caused a wave of unease in Layla's chest. "Maya!" Layla's voice was gentle, but her heart was pounding. The baby had stopped crying, a rare event. The little girl's eyes were wide open, her gaze locked on something in the distance. She made soft, cooing noises, her hands reaching for the air as though beckoning something closer. Layla stood up, her mind racing. The village had lived through harsh times, but this was different. Maya's behavior was unnatural. She reached out toward the doorway, and Layla followed her gaze, looking out into the darkening desert. There, in the distance, she saw a shadow moving against the dunes. Something large, something powerful. The shadow was too distant to be certain, but it was unmistakably a lioness. The same lioness from the desert. Layla's heart skipped a beat as she watched the lioness's silhouette fade into the dunes. She had seen the creature's form more than once, but it was always in the distance, always a figure on the edge of the horizon. "Maya," Layla whispered, her voice trembling. Is she calling to the lioness?" Maya's gaze shifted back to Layla, her expression soft but filled with an unsettling calm. She let out a faint, almost imperceptible sound, as though acknowledging the unspoken connection that had grown between her and the wild. Strain and fear. As the village continued to adjust to the presence of Maya, Omar and Layla found themselves torn between the demands of survival and the growing mystery of the child. The physical strain of daily life was relentless, especially with Maya's increasing need for food and water, but the emotional weight of her presence grew heavier with each passing day. It became clear that they could not simply live as they had before. The village began to question what they were doing. Were they protecting the child, or were they encouraging something unnatural? The elders gathered frequently to discuss the situation. Their talks were quiet, intense, as they debated what should be done with Maya. Some wanted to embrace her as a blessing, a gift from the desert itself. Others were filled with fear, unsure whether this strange child could be the harbinger of disaster. "Maya is not just any child," one elder said one evening, his voice heavy with worry. "The desert knows her, and it may be testing us. We must care for her," another elder insisted. "The lioness protected her. We cannot ignore the fact that she was saved for a reason." Omar and Layla overheard the conversations, their own doubts growing with each passing day. Despite their best efforts, there was always a nagging fear that they were doing the wrong thing. Was it possible that Maya was the embodiment of some deeper, unspoken connection between the human world and the desert? Was the lioness merely a messenger, bringing a child into their lives who might carry with her the burden of the desert's past and future? The days were becoming harder. Food and water were scarce, and there was no sign of rain on the horizon. The wells were drying up, and the goats were growing weaker. The villagers were stretched thin, each day a struggle to maintain what little they had. And through it all, Maya's presence loomed over them. One evening, as the wind kicked up the dust and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Layla sat on the porch, cradling Maya in her arms. The baby's small hands grasped at her clothes, her eyes soft and filled with wonder as she gazed up at the sky. Layla's heart ached with love for the child, but she could not shake the feeling that the desert had placed a weight on their shoulders that they could not bear. "Maya," Layla whispered, her voice trembling, "what are we supposed to do with you?" The child smiled, a soft, serene smile that seemed to reassure Layla in ways she could not explain. And yet, a deep fear began to creep into her heart, a fear that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't control. Omar walked up behind her, his face worn with exhaustion. "She's special, Layla," he said quietly, "but I think we're running out of time. We can't survive here forever. We need to find a way to understand what's happening." Layla nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, but I don't think we can change what's already started." The desert's grip was tightening, and every day seemed to pull them closer to an unknown fate. Maya, with her strange, otherworldly connection to the land, had brought both wonder and dread to the village. The emotional and physical challenges of raising a child in such a harsh and unforgiving environment were only the beginning. And now, with every passing hour, it seemed that the desert itself was preparing to reveal its final, most mysterious lesson. As the weeks stretched into months, the village of Al-Namib found itself trapped between the mercy and mystery of Maya, the child who had been saved by the lioness. The desert, unforgiving as it was, had grown harsher with each passing day, and the villagers were beginning to feel the strain of caring for a child who seemed destined to change everything about their lives. The wells had all but run dry. The goats were weak, their once robust bodies now reduced to fragile skeletons, their cries of hunger filling the silence of the evenings. The land was not yielding, and the crops that had once promised a meager harvest now withered under the unrelenting sun. Hope seemed as barren as the desert surrounding them. But even amid this struggle, something remarkable was happening. Maya, though still a baby, had begun to show signs of something unusual. Her connection to the wild seemed to grow deeper with every passing day. She seemed to understand the movements of the animals, the rhythms of the desert, in ways that defied explanation. Maya's gaze, which had once been curious and innocent, now carried an intensity that made the villagers uneasy. Her eyes, dark like the earth after rain, seemed to hold wisdom that no child of her age should possess. Her hands, small as they were, reached out as though she were communicating with the wind, the goats, and the very sands beneath her feet. The villagers, though awed by her, began to wonder if there was something more at work in her life. A power that had been set in motion by the lioness's intervention, something that was beyond their understanding. Omar, who had once been her protector and savior, now found himself struggling with the weight of responsibility. Every day he felt the tension in his chest grow heavier. The promise he had made to the lioness was becoming increasingly difficult to keep. He watched as Maya grew stronger, more attuned to the land, and his own fears began to take root. He had been told that the desert could take as easily as it gave, and he feared that it was preparing to test them all in ways they could not possibly prepare for. The mysterious visitor. It was late in the evening when the first sign of what was to come appeared. Omar had been out in the fields, tending to the last of their surviving goats, when a rider appeared on the horizon. He was cloaked in the shadows of the setting sun, his figure obscured by the dunes. The sight of a stranger in the desert at this hour was rare enough, but a figure on horseback was unheard of. Omar's heart skipped a beat. He dropped the bucket of water he had been carrying and stood frozen for a moment, watching the rider's slow approach. The man seemed to be heading straight for the village, as though he knew exactly where he was going. As the rider grew closer, Omar's instincts told him that this was no ordinary traveler. There was something about the way the man carried himself, something that spoke of authority and purpose. His cloak billowed around him like the desert itself, and his eyes, though hidden beneath a hood, gleamed with a knowing light. Omar, though cautious, approached the man. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with uncertainty. The man stopped his horse just a few feet away, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he removed his hood. His face was weathered, like someone who had spent a lifetime under the harsh sun, but his eyes were sharp enough to see the faint unease in Omar's stance. "I am Zaid," the man said, his voice low but commanding. "I've come seeking the child." The words hit Omar like a thunderclap. He took a step back, his mind racing. "What do you mean, seeking the child?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and fear. "Why would you be looking for her?" Zaid's eyes never wavered. "The child is not just a child," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "She is the key to something much greater." The lioness was not simply protecting her. She was guiding her to something the desert has been waiting for. Omar felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising. "Who are you? What do you want with Maya?" Zaid's gaze softened. "The desert has its own laws, Omar," he said, "and the child you have raised is tied to them. She is not merely a survivor of an accident. She was chosen by the desert, by the lioness." Omar shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. "No, you're wrong. She's just a baby, a child like any other." Zaid smiled grimly. "She may seem like a child to you, but the desert has been waiting for someone like her, a bridge between the wild and the human. Her presence here is no accident, and now the desert is calling to her. It's time for her to fulfill her purpose." Omar took a step back, his mind reeling. "Purpose? What do you mean by purpose?" he demanded. "She's just a child, a gift, a miracle." Zaid's expression grew darker, his voice lower. "She is more than that. The desert is dying, Omar. The land is thirsty, and the people are starving. The cycle has come to an end, and the desert needs to be reborn. The child will lead the way. The desert's demands." Omar's heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. A purpose? A savior for the desert? His thoughts were clouded with fear and disbelief. Maya had brought nothing but wonder to their lives. Had she truly been chosen for something so grand? What was Zaid talking about? And why had the lioness of all creatures saved her? "What do you want from her?" Omar's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want anything from her," Zaid replied, his voice calm, though there was an undeniable urgency beneath it. "She must answer the call of the desert. Only she can bring forth what is needed to restore balance." The conversation hung heavy in the air as Omar struggled to understand. Could it be true? Was Maya truly tied to the desert's fate? She had always been different, yes, but this was more than Omar could process. "I will not let you take her," Omar said fiercely, his voice rising. Zaid's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the sadness in his eyes. "I'm not here to take her," he said gently. "I'm here to guide her, to help her fulfill her destiny. But the desert's call is growing louder. She cannot ignore it much longer." The decision and the final test. As the night fell and Zaid disappeared into the shadows of the desert, Omar was left alone with his thoughts. Maya slept soundly in her crib, her small form rising and falling with each gentle breath. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, and yet Omar now understood that her existence was part of something much larger, something that none of them could escape. In the morning, Omar set out to find the answers he needed. He trekked into the heart of the desert, knowing that his journey would lead him to the truth about Maya, about the lioness, and about the desert's fate. He reached the place where he had first found Maya, the desolate spot where the lioness had left her. And as he stood there, the wind howling around him, the ground beneath him trembled slightly. The earth seemed to come alive, responding to some unseen force. Then, from the distance, he saw it. The lioness. Her golden eyes gleamed in the sunlight as she emerged from the dunes, walking steadily toward him. She did not growl or roar. She simply walked, as if beckoning him to follow. Omar knew that his time had come. The desert had chosen Maya, and now it was time to fulfill her purpose. With a final, resolute glance at the lioness, he nodded, understanding the weight of his responsibility. The lioness stopped in front of him, lowering her head in a gesture of respect. And in that moment Omar understood. This was no ordinary child. She was the desert's answer, its protector, its savior. And together they would restore balance. Back in the village, the news of Maya's calling spread like wildfire. The villagers, once skeptical, now understood the truth. Maya had been chosen, and she would lead them into a new era, a time of renewal for the desert. Her bond with the land, the lioness, and the creatures of the wild was undeniable. In the weeks that followed, the rains began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, as if the desert itself was awakening from a long slumber. The goats grew stronger, the crops began to flourish, and the village, once on the brink of collapse, began to thrive once more. Omar, Layla, and the villagers watched as Maya, the child of the desert, grew into the role she was destined to play. She had answered the call, and with the lioness by her side, the desert was reborn. Maya had fulfilled her purpose, and in doing so had saved not just the desert, but the people who had once doubted her. This climactic twist and resolution bring closure to the mystery of Maya's purpose and the desert's calling. Omar and the village must accept that Maya's presence is part of something larger, an ancient bond between the land and its creatures, and the child who would restore balance to the world around her. As the rains began to fall slowly and steadily, the desert seemed to breathe again. The once dry earth soaked up the moisture like a parched traveler reaching for a drink of water. The cracked ground, which had been barren for so long, began to swell with life. Tiny green shoots peeked through the dust, defying the weight of years of drought and hardship. For the first time in many seasons, the village of Al-Namib felt the promise of renewal. The air, once thick with dust and dry winds, now carried the scent of earth and growth. It was as if the desert itself was awakening from a long, restless sleep, stretching its limbs, and rediscovering the beauty of life. Flowers bloomed where once only thorns had grown, and the trees, their roots reaching deep into the nourishing soil, seemed to stand taller, proud to embrace the sky once more. But through all of this, there was still a quiet, reflective weight that lingered over the village. The people no longer saw the desert as their enemy, but as a part of them, something to be respected, something that had given them the very life they fought so hard to protect. The desert had not just taken from them, it had given something even greater in return. Maya's role, the child of the desert. Maya, the child who had been saved by the lioness and brought into their lives, was growing, though still too young to fully comprehend the weight of what she had come to represent. But the villagers, especially Omar and Layla, could feel the shift in the air when she was near. There was an undeniable energy around her, an aura that seemed to pulse in time with the earth itself. It was as if Maya was more than just a child. She was the heart of the desert, its past and future intertwined with her existence. Omar often found himself standing on the edge of the village at sunset, watching the sky turn from gold to crimson, and thinking about the strange journey he had embarked on. He remembered the moment he had first found Maya in the desert, lying in the cradle that the lioness had left for him. The feeling of wonder, fear, and confusion that had gripped him in that moment seemed so distant now. But now, with the rains falling and the desert beginning to bloom again, Omar couldn't help but reflect on the role that Maya had played in all of this. She had been the one to answer the call of the desert, the one who had bridged the gap between humanity and the wild world around them. She had been the lioness's chosen. She had been the desert's gift to them. What did it all mean? It was a question that Omar often pondered. How had Maya, a mere child, become the catalyst for the desert's transformation? How had the lioness known to bring her to them? There were no answers to these questions, not in the way that he had once hoped to find them. The truth, he realized, wasn't something to be understood or explained. It was something to be felt, something that could only be experienced by those who were open to it. Perhaps, he thought, that was the true lesson of the desert. The lioness, a symbol of protection and trust. As the seasons passed, the lioness, the fierce protector who had once saved Maya, began to fade into legend. The villagers no longer saw her in the distance, watching over them. But even though her physical presence had disappeared, the memory of her remained a constant source of reflection and gratitude. The lioness had come from the wild, a force of nature that knew no boundaries. She had acted out of instinct, yes, but there was something more profound in her actions. She had saved Maya without question, without hesitation. In that act of mercy, she had bridged the gap between two worlds, the human world and the wild, untamed world of the desert. Omar often thought about the lioness and the way she had looked at him when she had handed over the child. There had been no hostility in her eyes, no fear. There had only been trust, and unspoken trust that Omar would protect Maya, that he would care for her, and that he would understand her role in the larger balance of the desert. The lioness had known something that Omar had yet to understand. The desert was not just a place of survival. It was a living, breathing entity that required respect. And Maya, as strange as it seemed, was the key to restoring that respect. What the lioness had given them was not just a child, it was a new beginning. The lioness had given them hope. As the rains continued to fall, bringing life to the parched land, the village began to rebuild. It was not just the earth that had been revived. It was the people as well. The villagers, who had once been torn by fear and doubt, now came together to celebrate the miracle they had witnessed. The elders, once cautious of the child's power, now spoke of her with reverence. They acknowledged the bond between Maya and the desert, seeing it as a sacred relationship that tied their people to something larger than themselves. They told stories of the lioness and of the great transformation they had witnessed, passing down the tale to the younger generation, who listened with wide eyes and open hearts. Omar and Layla, who had once been uncertain of their place in this strange new world, now understood their role in Maya's life. They were the ones who had been chosen to guide her, to protect her, and to help her fulfill the destiny that the desert had placed upon her. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also a blessing. They were part of something far greater than themselves. The desert had chosen them to be stewards of its renewal, and they would carry that honor for the rest of their lives. The village itself had changed. The people who once lived in isolation, focused only on survival, now saw the interconnectedness of all things. They understood that the desert was not just a place of scarcity and danger. It was a place of life, of cycles, of renewal. They had witnessed that firsthand in the way the land had responded to Maya's arrival. One evening, as the stars began to emerge in the sky, Omar sat on a hill overlooking the village, Maya by his side. She was older now, no longer an infant, but a young girl with bright eyes and an inquisitive spirit. She had inherited the strength of the lioness, the wisdom of the desert, and the heart of her people. She was more than just a child of the wild. She was a bridge between two worlds. Maya, Omar said quietly, looking at the stars. Do you understand now? She looked up at him, her gaze steady and knowing. Yes, she said simply. The desert speaks to me. I understand. Omar smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love for the child who had changed everything. He had once feared the desert, but now, standing with Maya at his side, he realized that the desert was not something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, something to be understood. The journey they had embarked on was far from over. The desert had renewed itself, but there was always more to learn, more to discover. The cycle of life, of renewal and change, was ongoing. And with Maya by his side, Omar knew that the future was no longer uncertain. As they stood together, watching the stars twinkle above, Omar felt a deep sense of peace. He had fulfilled his promise to the lioness. He had cared for the child, and in doing so, he had been a part of something that transcended time, something that was as ancient as the desert itself. Maya, the child of the desert, had brought balance to their world. And in doing so, she had taught them all a vital lesson. The land and the people were not separate. They were one. And as long as they respected that bond, they would thrive together. In the quiet of the night, under the stars and the desert sky, Omar understood at last. The desert had given them a second chance. A chance to live in harmony with the land, with the animals, and with each other. And for that, he would be forever grateful.